Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Italian tasting. We're going to do something just a little bit different at this one. Most of our tastings, whether virtual or when they were in the store, were 10 wines on a topic and built over a series of flights. We thought for this one, we'd just try and make it easier for those who are participating at home and virtually and shrink it down to a shorter presentation with just 3 wines. So that's what we're going to do today. Now, I do have to say that when I said we were only going to do 3 wines at a presentation, the film crew got a little bit shaky, like there wouldn't be enough left for them afterwards. So we added a 4th one, and then we added a little dessert, or I added a little dessert as well. So we're actually going to do 4.5 wines, the half being 1 in bottle. All of the wines are available for purchase over the website, and they will be linked, and you can use the discount code called Piedmont. You just plug that into the coupon code when you check out, and it'll give you a 20% discount across whichever wine you choose. You can do all 4.5 of the wines if you'd like, or you can just have 1 and listen to as much as you want to. Very nice to have you along for this journey. Now, what we're doing today as a tasting is the wines of Piedmont. And I have to say that this is one of my absolute favorite regions to be drinking from. I just extraordinarily love how the wines smell. I love the palate weight of the wines, their energy. I also have had the chance to meet many producers from the region, and I've also had the chance to visit the region many times and love it, think it's gorgeous, and it's just a beautiful place to vacation or drink wine. So if I go on too long about it, just keep drinking. It's my love hopefully showing through. Well, so let's take just a moment and talk about what is Piedmont and where is it, and put it in geographic relation. My hope is that as we go through this flight, I can give you a sense of the geography, also the history, some of the culinary practices, and link all of that down into the actual flavor of the wines. So we'll start with the geography of the region, and I'll do another batch of instant cartography for you here. So most of us find it easy to recognize Italy because of the boot, so no matter how out of scale this drawing is, I think you get the point. So here, Italy, the boot. Well, what is Piedmont? Piedmont is this area of Upper Italy. It is actually based around Milan is the largest town, and if you fly into Italy, Milan is a horrible airport to go through, but it gets you very close to wine-growing regions really rapidly. So Milan, right about there. Now, we think of Italy as a whole unified country, but it wasn't always a whole unified country, and it unified rather late compared to, say, France. With that in mind, one of the major kingdoms in Italy was actually the Kingdom of Milan, and that gives rise to one of our famous wines from this region and the saying about it, and that's Barolo, the wine of kings and the king of wines. I love Barolo so much that I have done entire presentations on just Barolo. I'll have you know that hopefully we'll get to that sometime soon. Okay, so this region of Piedmont. Now, if we blow that up, we're going to spend a lot of time in a town, in a college town called Alba. So the river that flows down, and right about off the river is this town called Alba. Now, one of my very fun visits to Piedmont was going up to Castiglione and to the castle on top of the hill. And that is where Luca Carrara has his winery Vieti. And we had an appointment there to get a tour of the winery, which is fascinating, and also taste through the wines with him personally. It was amazing though, because it started at around 11 a.m. We had flown in from Milan and jetted down there as fast as possible. And Luca takes us out onto the patio, and it's this vast expanse, because he's up on a hillside. It's this vast expanse of the vineyards of Barolo looking off over and across the river into Alba. And he starts the wine tasting by saying, well, if you think about this region, 2,500 years ago is when they started wine production. And the thought that honestly went through my head was not, oh my gosh, this is a fascinating and famous man who's about to tell a really amazing story. My thought was, oh, if this starts 2,500 years ago, we're never going to get a glass of wine. It's going to be ours. So with that in mind, I'd like you to start tasting and have this first glass. This first glass is maybe not representative of Piedmont, but it's still an important wine in Piedmont. So this first glass is made up of entirely the grape Arnaise. It's a white wine of delicate, but to me, beautiful perfume, white flowers and some pineapple, and then I think always really gorgeous on the palate. It's not super high acidity like a Sauvignon Blanc, but has a real wonderful texture to it. It's one that I enjoy if you're willing to go with this for me, because it's not in your face and it's not overly dramatic. It's just a great pairing partner that has all the complexity you need if you're looking for it. But if you just want to drink great wine, it's right here for you. Now, Arnaise, as a grape variety, actually has a fairly long and interesting history, but with some tragedy to it. And that relates also to this producer of Arnaise that we're choosing today, Malabalia. I've had the great pleasure of meeting the two daughters and sister and aunt of Malabalia. And one of the amazing, striking things, just one of them, is that all of them look like they just stepped out of an Italian fashion magazine. They are all rather strikingly gorgeous. On top of that, though, they're all also extremely wonderful, nice people. And finally, they make really delicious wine. It is, however, funny that the last time the sister of Malabalia presented to some of my clients, she's able to start her presentation by saying, I'm the 38th princess of this winery. And that's actually true. Her winery is a princess, is a kingdom, and has been for 38 generations. And they've been making wine that entire time. So if you look on this label, you'll see 1362 is Malabalia's first vintage, a rather incredible feat. Now, Malabalia is actually not located in Alba, but they're across the river and up in this area here called Roero. So, Roero is maybe not on the tip of your tongue when you think about Piedmont, but they do the full range of grapes that we're going to explore across the region, but are mostly known for their white wines. I would encourage you to explore Roero as much as you can, because here is a region where I think the wine quality is exceptionally high, yet the prices are oftentimes very low. And you'll see this if you go and shop for it online. So that's where it is. But with Arnaise, even though it has this 38th generation history, actually by the mid-1970s was nearly extinct. I think its total acreage dropped down to something less than 5. So very small and nearly going extinct. There were two producers that worked really hard to revive it. One was Vietti, the man I mentioned before, and Luca Corrado. Another one is Bruno Giacosa. And I've heard this story about Bruno Giacosa and Arnaise. It hasn't been directly told to me. He's passed away, but his daughter still makes the wine. But the story is that in the 1970s, Bruno Giacosa was attending church. And he would go make wine during the days and then on Sunday attend church. And he got to know the local clergyman. And the local clergyman really liked wine. The local priest really liked wine. And so when he was giving the sacrament, he chose really good wine. And in particular, the white wine seemed to be, to Bruno Giacosa, the white wine seemed to be really extraordinary. And so Bruno approached the priest and he said, what is this extraordinary white wine that you have? And the priest said, well, it's Arnaise. And even though Bruno Giacosa had lived in this region his entire life, he had never heard of it. And the priest said, well, no one makes it anymore. So I happen to know, 4 or 5 just families who in their backyard have a couple of vines each of Arnaise. And I go and I ask them to get the fruit for me, and then I have someone make the wine. So not much anymore. And that actually put a flare in Bruno Giacosa's mind, and he went and did the same thing. except for him, he went with the priest and asked those families for vine cuttings instead of just the fruit. And with those vine cuttings, he went about starting to replant Arnase. So again, even though Arnase has this long history dating back to the 14th century, by 1970, it was nearly extinct, and it was through the hard work of Bruno Giacosa that it came back to life. The Vieti was also part of that project as well, but to my understanding, Bruno kind of takes top triumph of that. So again, we'll just finish up. I'll take a taste of it, and then we'll move on to some red varieties. Okay. We're going to explore next the three major red varieties of Piedmont. Now, I mentioned with the Arnase, and I'll say it with the next one, Dolcetto and Barbera as well, that this isn't really necessarily representative of Piedmont. And let me explain what I mean by that a little bit. In my stores, we tend to have maybe 2 or 3 selections of Dolcetto, maybe 2 to 4 selections of Barbera, but then the main wine, the big one, which we'll get to, Barolo, we tend to stock more like 60 wines. And with Arnase, the same sort of thing. We have maybe 2 or 3 selections, but it's Barolo that takes top dog. So I said we could do entire presentations just Barolo, and I would love to do that. But with this, I wanted to give you a sampling of the region, even if it's not necessarily representative of the region's production. So that's why we're taking the flow as we are. Okay, so let's move on to our next wine, which is Luigi Einaudi's Dolcetto. Always a funny one to think about with its name, Dolcetto. You may, if you speak a little Italian, kind of get the emphasis there of dolce. And if you could make it, translate it, or put it into Dolcetto, it's the sweet little one. Now, when you taste this wine is not sweet. And also, quite frankly, in my many visits to Piedmont, I've never had a sweet Dolcetto. So why is this one called Dolcetto, or this little sweet one? To my understanding, it's actually because the acidity is rather low. So in comparison to the other red wines that we're going to have, it makes it to Piedmontese people seem sweet. So hence the sweet little one. Now, Dolcetto has a couple of things which are immediately recognizable. One is that it's almost always very dark colored. That just, Dolcetto has a lot of polymers in it that gives it a deep, dark color to it. That actually can cause a little bit of a problem during fermentation, because it can mean that the wine goes reductive, and you have to do things to correct it. Or it can also mean that the wine builds up a rather stern amount of tannins to it. So a stern amount of tannins and not much acidity, maybe not much mid-palate fruit, that becomes a hard web to weave for most winemakers. Well, so what do winemakers do with Dolcetto? And why is it here? It has a couple nice features for it, which is that it tends to grow rather robustly. Unlike one of its family members, Nebbiolo, there's no genetic association, one of the grapes planted alongside it, Nebbiolo. It tends to grow fairly well. It also tends to be harvested, and you can pick it. It tends to come to full maturity about 4 weeks before Nebbiolo and about 2 weeks before Barbera. What that means is, as a vintner, you can, or a vineyard owner, you can plant your Dolcetto in often poor areas that more fancy grapes or more expensive grapes can't go in. And it also means that you get a shot as a winemaker to pick the grapes when you have nothing else going on. Now, that gives rise to a certain style of Dolcetto, and that certain style of Dolcetto is one that if you make it to the region, you'll hear about over and over again, and I have a friend who teases me about it. Every Piedmont winery I've been to, especially every Barolo winery I've been to, they like to taste you through the whole range, so they want you to taste all of the wines. They recognize that if you're American, you've traveled a long way, so they want to kind of do it up. But they always start with Dolcetto. And one of the things they almost always say is, we make the freshest dolcetto. And it does remind me of Steve Martin that we have the freshest dolcetto always. Well, so what are they doing as winemakers? They're making it work for them with everything that I just discussed. They're picking at maturity, but that means they've got at least 2 weeks, if not 4 weeks, before they have to deal with other fruit. But 2 weeks still isn't long, especially for wines that are supposed to spend at least 38 months in barrel with some of them, like Barolo. So they usually go and they ferment it fairly quickly. And they ferment it fairly quickly in stainless steel. Again, the idea is the freshness of it. And they get it fermented and they get it fully dry. And usually within 3 or 4 days, they're able to send it off to a different tank and just forget about it for a while and start focusing on the wines that are more expensive. Thus, you get dolcettos that are very fresh always. Now, I do happen to, that sounds sort of like I'm being dismissive of dolcettos, and I do happen to like them, and I think they have wonderful food applications. The dark fruit character that they can carry, but yet the freshness on the palate makes them go really well with savory items that may have a touch of sweet, like if you think of lamb kebabs and roasted shallots with maybe a pomegranate molasses. Dolcetto is a great pairing for that kind of cuisine and fits really nicely. Now, all that being said, I think those of you who are tasting along are going to say something like this. Well, wait a second. You're talking about dolcetto being fresh and, maybe just juicy and vibrant and fun to drink. Yet this Luigi Einaudi really doesn't showcase any of that. This Luigi Einaudi showcases a dolcetto that is fairly complex and layered. In addition to that raspberry fruit, it has lovely notes of earth character, touches of spice that come from oak, and then on the palate, it's got a density and richness, and again, a layer of complexity to it. Well, so what's going on here, and I particularly chose this one because I love it, is that some producers and some areas of Piedmont really focus on making dolcettos. So while many people are dedicated to the very fresh style, Luigi Einaudi is actually dedicated to making a very serious style of dolcetto. Serious to the point that it will age up to 10 years in your cellar. And again, if you look at the price point, it's incredibly cheap for the quality of wine that you're getting. That is very purposeful on their part. First off, it comes from a township called Doliani. And Doliani is actually really famous for making dolcettos. When I've talked to producers and they've said, we're making a fresh style, and then I say, well, we just had a Doliani, and they'll say, well, of course, the Doliani, it's from there. It's going to be a very different style of wine. So the location of where this is grown, which is just south of Barolo, is very important and is considered the most prestigious area for growing dolcetto. The second thing actually relates to Luigi Einaudi himself. He was actually the finance minister of Italy for many years, and then actually was, after World War II, Italy's first prime minister. So a rather important and famous man in the history of Italy. And he came from Doliani, and you guessed it, his family's main wine was dolcetto. Now, the Einaudi family makes all the wines that were, they make Barolo, they make Nebbiolo, they make Barbera, but this one in particular, they keep named after him for that reason. Even though he was extremely busy as a man, it's said of him that he never missed a harvest. Always would return home to make sure that the family's crop made it in. So, an opposite of what I said, but I think it gives you a shot at exploring two different styles of dolcetto, and certainly a magnificent and wonderful wine. All right. Our next wine here is going to come from the de Fourville family. And the de Fourville family is in a township called Barbaresco. So if you go actually north of Alba, you reach the small town of Barbaresco. Now, Barbaresco is one of the two areas that grow the grape Nebbiolo. I'll put it on here. The other one is the series of villages that make up the Barolo DOC. So the de Fourville family is in Barbaresco, and we're here tasting this wine and their Barbera. Now, Barbera is an interesting grape variety because it probably comes from somewhere else. Genetically, it's not linked to any of the other Piedmont varieties, so it was brought in at some point, and it's not really sure where. Other interesting things to note is Barbera is one of the few Piedmont varieties that I think, I'll say this, tends to work well around the world and in different areas. So it tends to fit, whereas I don't really believe Dolcetto or Nebbiolo tend to work well across the world. So Barbera, an interesting variety here. Now, Barbera shares some of the factors of Dolcetto. It doesn't come in quite as early, but it typically comes in at least 2 weeks earlier than your Nebbiolo. So as a vineyard manager or a winemaker, it's again one where you get a shot at making it with nothing else going on in the winery. Kind of spaces you out, and it also gives you another product to sell. Barbera also can be planted far and wide and likes all kinds of different sites. So you can have Barbera growing pretty much anywhere you want to have Barbera. This actually gives rise to why you have Barbera d'Astis and Barbera d'Albas, is because they're planted throughout the zone. One thing Barbera has, and another thing it lacks that's different from Dolcetto though, is Barbera tends to have very high acidity, so very different than the Dolcetto, which tends to be lower. And then Barbera tends to have little to no tannins. So it's sort of the flip, if you will, of the Dolcetto. So again, most producers chose to make it and make it in a fairly fresh style. Now, unlike with Dolcetto though, there have been some changes in that, and those changes started in the 70s, 80s, and going into the 90s. I think, can't verify, but I can quote the Oxford Companion of saying this, that producers in this region, Piedmont, were reflecting on Super Tuscans, wines of Chianti that were better than the regular Chianti, usually from modern winemaking methods or including other varieties than the indigenous ones. So in the late 70s, but stretching into the 80s and 90s, I think many Piedmontese producers started looking and reflecting on that and reflecting on what they could do with Barbera. So this gives rise to the fact that you can taste it today to two very different styles of Barbera. One style is the style that's made fresh. It's made usually in stainless steel. It's harvested earlier, usually has no oak to it, and it gives really pretty, juicy wines of a kind of red berry fruit character. Another style is, and people don't say this, but I will for clarity, the Super Barbera. A Barbera that's harvested later, that is purposely let to get richer, that is then extracted more at the winery, and oftentimes is put in new oak barrels with the idea of adding some spice character to that red fruit, and then also adding some tannins to the wine to kind of bulk it up. Now, both those styles I do enjoy, and they are completely different from one another. So it's always interesting when you taste a Barbera to see what producers are going to do with that. Now, fascinatingly enough, that Super Barbera, probably one of the first, was again with the man named Bruno Giacosa, but it's Vietti's that kind of takes top dog there. You can explore those throughout our shelves and as you go along and see the differences between the two. Here with the de Fourvilles, I thought I'd kind of take something down the middle, if you will. It's a wine that has lovely dark fruit character to it, but it also has and in addition to the dark character fruit, has a depth of flavor, but it really doesn't see any new oak. It's all old oak, so the spice character you get is from the fruit itself. Now, in the fact that it's seen some old time maturation in old oak barrels also means that it's not one of the brilliantly fresh, really cherry fruited Barberas. So again, I don't mean to, I was gonna say middle of the road of de Fourville. I don't mean to say that it's imply that it's bad quality in any way. It's one of my favorites. So. Now we just drink this one. So Piedmont has a famous wine region in it, and that wine region is Barolo. And that's the one I referred to before as the wine of kings and the king of wines. It's a wine that I deeply love and think is just magnificent and one of my favorites to be drinking across the entire wine world. Now, just taking a step back for a little bit as we introduce and finish with this one, you'll notice all the other bottles that are in front of us have the grape variety on the label. With Barolo, you don't have that. And in fact, Barolo's sister or brother or other region, Barbaresco, you don't have that either. What you do, so what the grape is the grape is Nebbiolo. And when Nebbiolo is grown within the townships that make up Barolo, the wine can take the name on its label, and almost every producer who can label a wine Barolo labels it Barolo because these are expensive wines. The same thing with Barbaresco. Barbaresco has to be 100% of the grape variety Nebbiolo. Wines grown within that region, the villages of Barbaresco, tend to take the name Barbaresco on the label because, again, it is more prized. You will see bottlings with just Nebbiolo on the label, and that's because Nebbiolo can be planted throughout this entire Piedmont region, and producers do that. And many producers do it because it allows them to get a wine to you that is Nebbiolo, that also showcases their house style, but isn't priced as high as most Barolos are. So Barolo and the great Nebbiolo, intrinsically linked together. Now, what of Nebbiolo? To me, it's a gorgeous wine, and here's why. I just love it for everything that it is, and you can smell it in this glass and taste it too. I've always adored the perfume of Nebbiolo, and it's a perfume like no other. The classical way that Psalms talk about it is roses and tar. I don't particularly get the tar aspect, but I definitely get the rose flower aspect to it. To me, maybe instead of that dark fruit character or that dark earthiness, I would say that it tends to resemble the smell of one of the prized agricultural products of the region, which is white truffles. So roses and white truffles, what's not to like? And then when you taste it on the palate, you can sense two things immediately. One is that here is a grape variety that is turned into a wine that has high acid character. And it's also a grape variety that has given the wine very high tannic character as well. So it's a very stern wine, if you will, having both high acid and high tannin. The other thing that I think many people notice when they first taste it is that on the palate, it's a little bit lower fruited. And I shouldn't even say a little bit. It tends to be a low fruited variety to my palate, meaning it doesn't necessarily have luscious, thick mid-palate like, say, an American Zinfandel might have. Now, I love that trio of factors going on in the glass, and I think it makes it one of the most extraordinary wines. It also makes it one of the most age-worthy wines, which is why you get two factors with it. First, producers have to hold it for a long time. They have to hold it for at least 18 months in barrel, and then they have to hold it for a combined total of 38 months in barrel or bottle before they can release it. That typically means that by the time it gets bottled, rested, sent over to us, that it's 5 years old when it hits my shelves. Now, beyond that factor is that it ages incredibly long. And with my Barolo collection, I tend to like to start drinking them at 10 years old. And then some of them will go even farther than that. I've had the lucky chance of having a 1961 Barolo that was still fresh, vibrant, and gorgeous drinking at that must have been its at least 50th birthday. So very, very long-term aging wine. With that being said, I want to take you on what I hope is a fascinating trip across Barolo, even though it's this tiny village town, and explore the elements of its flavors, while looking at soil types, and then also some of its history while again exploring the flavors of what's in the glass. So we'll start by taking this, the area of Barolo, and I'm just going to blow it up down here in the corner. Now, the area of Barolo is actually 5 townships that are banded together. So, okay, again, this blowing up over here, I know, completely accurate. What you get in Barolo, the region, is a river system that cuts it like this. And those townships, and actually one up here, so those townships sort of fall in clusters and in soil types. One of them is up here, and that one is Lamora. And if you're into wine tourism, Lamora is actually the highest point in Barolo, and from the town square of Lamora, you can look out and you can see all the other townships. It's a beautiful place to go and look. Then down here is the very small township of Barolo, so Barolo, if you will, just like New York, New York. Then you get Castiglione, and over here, Serralunga, and then Monforte. There you go. So the 5 townships and the acreage that surrounds them. Now, with these townships, Lamora and Barolo actually sit on a soil type that they share called Tartonian soil, whereas Monforte, Castiglione, and Serralunga sit on Helvetian soil. That actually, I think you can taste and feel in the wines. And again, if you wanted to explore our online selection more or come into one of the stores, we could point out to you which of the soil types these wines are on. But wines that come from that Tartonian, from Lamora and Barolo, I really experience as having a higher perfume character to them, with Canubi kind of being the most dramatic single cru of it. And then also having a lesser, not nearly as strongly sided tannin character that the others have. Now again, we're in Barolo, so this is all relative to Barolo and the grape Nebbiolo. But I think you can always notice that, and you can always experience it, and it'll be located right in your glass. So even the novice who's just jumping into Nebbiolo and Barolo, if given 3 glasses, will be able to tell the difference between them. Now that gets even more dramatic when you go to the townships of Serralunga and Monforte, and that's where the soil type firmly switches. And that soil type tends to make the Barolos have a really strong tannic character, just incredibly girth to those tannins, and a lower perfume character to them. So opposite sides of what the wines do. And again, I think you can always feel that and know that in the wines. Castiglione is actually the transition point of those 2 soil types. So it's a mixture of those 2. For us in this reference, you can see on the bottle, this is Castiglione. So it gives us a portrait of maybe the middle ground of those 2 soil types. But again, you can feel it in the bottles and you can go looking for it. Now, a couple of other factors before we leave the soil type. There was a classical way of making Barolo, and it really involved negotiants, or it involved communal growing and winemaking. Why did that exist? Probably because when Barolo was first getting famous way back in the 14th century and moving forward, it was the kings of this area of Italy that first planted a lot of the land. So they are the ones who planted vast tracts of the land and had really subsistence farmers farm it for them. Well, that process evolved, and it evolved into the 20th century to the point where a lot of Barolo was being made collectively or by negotiants. What does that mean? It means that if you were a farmer around the town of Lamora and you had a vineyard and growing grapes, you probably weren't making your own wine. You were picking the grapes, But then you would take it down to the town center and you would have the winemaker or the communal wine person pay you for the grapes, and they would process it and turn it into wine. So when people start talking about very ancient bottles of Barolo, I'm always a little bit skeptical about how ancient those bottles can get, because it's really not until post-World War II that things start to change. Now take that idea though of small farmers, they don't have enough money to buy their own winemaking equipment or cellar wine for that long, so that's why they were making it as communal wine. And again, that wine that I mentioned was from the ancient one I had from the 60s, was from a maker called Borgono, who still exists today, and they are mostly buying fruit and turning it into wine. Now with that in mind, combine that with the soil types and the different expression of Barolo that you get across these soil types. What many of those people were doing is they would take grapes from different regions and blend it together. Different regions of Barolo, so the different townships of the Barolo. The idea with that is that they were going to make a blend, and the blend would represent the best parts of the entire area. So blending grapes across Barolo. One producer I have, they have some very old bottles. They're based in Lamora, but their very old bottles are actually a significant portion of Serra Lunga. And one of my clients who loves Barolo and loves aging it started poking the winery, trying to figure out in their back records what percentage of the Nebbiolo came from Serra Lunga versus Lamora in the old bottles. You can do that if you want, certainly an interesting process. Now, if that kept going into the 1940s and 50s and communal blending, in the 60s, two other trends emerged. One trend that emerged, brought about by a man named Ratti, was that there would be single vineyards in Barolo, which they call crus. Ratti was the first, but others have followed him. The idea being that, yes, my wine may come from the village of Lamora, but there's a specific vineyard called Brunate, which is a very good vineyard and for centuries has been known as a very good vineyard. And so I'm going to isolate that vineyard itself and make Barolo only from the cru of Brunate. So you'll see that nowadays, and that's typically when you start to see really expensive Barolo, is Barolo that has a cru name on it. The idea there is a little bit maybe Burgundian, but the idea is that these are vineyards that have always been acknowledged as making the greatest wine, and bottling them separately makes the absolute greatest expression of that. A little bit different than the previous process. Now that really didn't take hold. Ratti was the first in the 60s, but that really didn't take hold until the 1970s and 80s and 90s. It's one of the reasons that I think Barolo is fascinating, because even though it's this ancient place to grow grapes, the history of it is really quite modern. One final note, and then we'll leave and we'll talk about the Barolo boys a little bit more, or Barolo boys. One final note is that many producers now still do blends, even if they're domains. And they'll often call those the classic Barolos, instead of saying the blended Barolo, the classic Barolo. So if you hear me or you hear producers say that, it probably means that it's a blend across their vineyard holdings. And in fact, that is exactly what this bottle of Vietti is it's a blend across all of the properties that he owns. Vietti is owned by the 6th generation scion of the Vietti family, the man I introduced before, named Luca Corrado. Luca has been a pioneer in Barolo and making Barolos, and I think he now makes some of the best. This is the classic, meaning it's the blend of his crus, and I always think it's a dramatic value in tasting Barolo and what you get in the glass. His great-grandfather actually has the amazing and outstanding representation of recognizing the quality of cru Barolo right around the 1900s and going and purchasing parcels of all the great vineyards across the 5 townships of Barolo. So one tasting, if you're feeling extravagant, that you can do is collect all of the Vietti Cru Barolos and taste them side by side. Okay, so take a taste of that in that glass, or you should have been drinking all along, because I went on for a very long time there. And I think you can sense something there that definitely relates to the soil types, but also maybe something a bit more that relates to winemaking and the modern history of Barolo. And that's where I'd like to take you next. To me, with that glass, you get the beautiful perfume of Nebbiolo. Again, to me, roses and white truffles is the way to go with that. And then on the palate, you can sense it's fairly young, that it's got a lot of tannin character to it. It's pretty powerful stuff, and in fact, leaves your mouth quite dry after drinking it. So it's a bit young and probably has a goodly amount of Monforte, Serralunga, and Castiglione fruit in it, driving it that way. But you can also sense that there's a bit of roundness on the mid-palate, that it's not entirely without fruit, even though earlier I said low fruit. It's not entirely without fruit. It's got some richness there. And that actually draws us into the trend that happened starting in the 70s, but really going strongly into the 1980s, and I would say at least up until 2000. So really recent history in Barolo. And that we can say is the rise of the Barolo boys. Okay, how am I going to get this to the glass? So just keep drinking and I'll make it there. The Barolo boys were a set of boys. Piedmont is actually pretty patriarchal still, and I'll have a joke about that in a second. But they were a set of boys. And these boys went to enological school, sometimes traveled a little bit more around the world, but then came back to their family estates in Barolo in the late 70s and early 80s. Now, at that point and at that time, Barolo's reputation was not what it is today, and the bottles weren't priced like they were today. To represent this, I had one producer, a man who is still alive and was a member of the Barolo boys, Elio Altare. And he said when he came back, the region was actually so poor, especially for people farming, that if he went to a discotheque, he had to hide his hands because the girls would look at the boys' hands, and if they were farmers' hands, they knew they were dirt poor in Barolo or in Alba, and they weren't going to dance with them. So an amazing, but you'll remember, right? So when he came back, and a bunch of them came back together, they took a look around and they thought, why, if this wine is the king of wines, why are we not making more money for it? And why are, in fact, these wines actually not so tasty? Why do these wines take 10, 20, 50 years to come around and taste good, if they ever taste good at all? And why can't we get anyone to buy them? All of these thoughts about what to do in Barolo. And so what they came up with, and I guess you would have to also posit their thoughts at this is the time when people started drinking more wine, but they also wanted to drink their wines younger. That the wine world had opened up more, and it wasn't all British aristocrats whose grandfathers collected wine and they had access to their cellars. It was people who wanted to drink and drink on a Tuesday night. Well, so these Barolo boys with that in the background, thought about how to raise the quality of Barolo and make Barolo into the wine of kings and internationally represented for that. They did a couple of things, and they were all filed under eventually the idea of modernizing Barolo. So these Barolo boys became the modernists. Well, the first thing that they did, and Elio Tare was the first one to do this, was they started green harvesting in the vineyard. Now, this was shocking to any farmer in Barolo. Now, the idea of green harvesting is about halfway through the year, the vintage, you go and you start snipping off berries. The idea is that when you snip off some berries, 25%, 30%, 50% of the berries that are left are of higher quality, and the grapevine is going to put all their energy into just what's left, meaning that you're going to get much more concentrated, much more sophisticated fruit. When Elio Altare first did this, his father was so horrified that he had done it that he actually disinherited him and kicked him off of the family winery. That's why you get Elio Altare as his own winery later. So a radical idea. Now, the other ideas that they pursued was taking a look at the winery itself. And you have to imagine what they were looking at, and I've heard some of them say this, is that at that point in time, you're standing in a winery that has, because you had no money to do it, hasn't been refurbished maybe for 100 years. It hasn't had any new barrels, and again, maybe not new barrels for 100 years. So just an old, dusty winery that may have huge bacterial issues going on in it. So that might be the backdrop when they took a look at the wineries that they were working in, and they decided on a couple of things. First off, they would speed up fermentation and use something called a rotor fermenter. Now, most Barolo at that time was being fermented for a very long time, 30, 60, 90 days. That's incredibly long. The idea of that long fermentation, and some producers still do it, is that you would get the tannins to bind together, and so eventually the wine would soften. You'd get those long tannins to bind and they'd fall out of the solution. The wine would get softer as it aged for that long of a time. It also, unfortunately, in addition to softening the tannins, would strip out fruit character and also strip out color. So to the modernist Barolo producer, these were wines that might have a lovely perfume, but had no body to them. Further, across that long maceration, if you weren't careful, your wine was getting oxidized. Literally, it was in the process of turning into vinegar. So the modernists sped it up. They used stainless steel and they used rotor fermenters, and they eventually shortened it down, some of them to just 3 days of maceration. Most of them were more like 9, 12 days of maceration. The idea of that short maceration was to preserve the fruit character of Nebbiolo. So instead of this dried out flowery wine, you got a wine of richness on the mid-palate, blue fruit, and some red fruit to it as well. The next thing that they did is they started buying new barrels, and not just any old new barrels. They started buying new French oak barrels, what they call in Italy barrique. This was an incredibly radical idea to do. A man named Clerico took it so far that he was double oaking his wines at times. But the idea was something like you would do with a Napa Cabernet in a typical barrel, the barrique, and a smaller barrel for Italy, the barrique. New French oak would impart the flavors of spice, of clove, of cinnamon to the wine. It would also allow for micro-oxygenation that would draw the tannin character out of the wine, soften it and smooth it, make it darker and more concentrated, just like you would see in Napa Cabs. So these factors of modernization radically changed what Barolo was like. And again, it was a pack of about 8 to 12 producers that did it and got nicknamed the Barolo Boys. Now here's my little joke about the Barolo Boys. For whatever reason, and it's funny when you see the patriarchal society that is really Barolo, all of those Barolo boys had daughters. So now almost all the Barolo boys and their wineries are being led by their daughters, which is a radical change in Barolo. Okay, so that sets up a juxtaposition, and that juxtaposition actually came to the fore with the with the 99 2000 vintage in Barolo. And that juxtaposition was that the modernists had taken it too far. Barolo didn't taste and didn't smell like Barolo anymore. It smelled like something international and not even of Nebbiolo. The traditionalists felt like that's the major critique that was going on. The modernists, of course, referred to the traditionalists as dirty winemakers who were making flawed wine that somehow people accepted. Well, this never really came to a head. There is a movie called The Barolo Boys that dramatizes it, and Bartolo Mascarello and Domenico Clerico, two Barolo producers, get into it a little bit in the movie and start bashing each other. But I think what most producers came to the conclusion, 2001 vintage, 5, 9 forward, is that there's a path between. You can both have traditional macerations or use new oak. And you can use rotor fermenters or use old oak. You can drop fruit in the vineyard or you can crop it heavy. All of these things now are part of Barolo. To me, having experienced those vintages when they first came out, I can tell you that I love it either way. I happen to adore Silvia Altare. She took over for Elio Altare, and she maintains her dad's standards of lots of new oak and lots of concentration. I absolutely adore that. I have had wonderful bottles of Bartolo Mascarello. He maintained the 90-day maceration in all old oak. So to me, any which way you want it. Now, back to the glass and finishing up. Luca Corrado of Vieri wasn't a Barolo boy, but he certainly had his experimentations in using lots of new oak. And you can taste that in the early 90 vintages. And by and large, I would say that in comparison to what he's doing now, those wines are good, but what he's doing now is absolutely great and outstanding. So here it's right cut down the middle. It's about 25% new oak. He's not using rotor fermenters, but he's also not macerating for an incredibly long time. So see if you can take that history, pull it apart, and taste all of that in the glass. Now, just to wrap up Barolo, I think this wine is always so magnificent and so complex and so profound that I find the simplest of dishes go best with it. I don't think trying to make the complexity of the dish, just let the dish be simple because the wine's going to take it away. So here, if you're ordering a pizza, go with a Barolo. It's perfect. If you want some traditional dishes of the region, Tyrrhene, it's a type of pasta. It sort of looks like pasta bolognese, but don't tell them I said that. It's amazing with Barolo. I have this wonderful experience at another winery of a grandma serving me little tortellini with sage and veal. Perfect partner with Barolo. There's also, of course, the dish beef and Barolo. Now, don't pour your $40 Barolo on top of beef and stick it in the oven. Go ahead and get yourself some Nebbiolo from the outlying regions, but a perfect match. And again, white truffles, if you get a chance, they are the partner to Barolo, and they're the regional partner as well. Okay, one more wine. We stick the bonus at the end here. Let me grab it. Aha. So you'll notice, these are all kind of big wines. Even our smallest, the Dolcetto still has some power, the Barbera some richness, and of course Barolo is big, big, big heavy wine. So I'm going to introduce you to this. This is a Moscato d'Asti. Now I know you're all going to poo-poo me here that I'm not a serious wine person, but here's what I have for you with Moscato d'Asti. Yes, it is sweet, yes, it is slightly fizzy, and yes, it is low alcohol, which means that it's perfect for your grandma to just get boozed up on. But my story here is with this producer, a man named Dottore Roberto Marchesi de Greci. He makes very serious wine. He is a Barbaresco producer. He actually, in my history, visited me on the very first day I opened my very first store. And we tasted through his entire lineup of 14 wines, ending with 3 single vineyard Barbarescos. You can imagine the palate fatigue and the buildup of tannins. And then he said, aha, I've got a Moscato. And I said, no, I don't want a Moscato, it's not good. And he said, here's the thing. Here, we just tasted all this big, big wine. And if you were eating it with beef and Barolo and all those pastas, you've been eating for hours and drinking for hours, and now you feel fat and heavy. Voila, you bring out the Dolcetto, you drink it straight away, and you feel like you've lost 10 pounds. So I always recommend it. Try it now. You'll feel like you've lost 10 pounds. And with that, cheers. Thanks for drinking along.